Good afternoon and welcome to the Rotary Club of Kerrville. At this time, I'd invite you to please silence your cell phones, but during the process, check in on Facebook and let the world know where we're at, or Twitter or Instagram or whatever else is out there to use. So at this time, I'd like to ask Rosa Lavender to come up and lead us in our invocation and pledge, please.
If you'll please bow your heads. Gracious Father, we thank you for another beautiful day in the Texas Hill Country. Bless those here who work in law enforcement and emergency services, and bless all of our soldiers overseas as they strive to protect our country. Bless this food to the nourishment of our bodies and us to your service. Amen. Please join me for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Rosa.
Well, I had a reasonable response to our song last week, which was the second verse of the Texas state song. And I want to let you know there's actually 3 verses to it. A little trivia about it. The thing was written in 1924 by a guy from Britain, of all things. And in 1929, the state held a contest to pick a state song, and they picked this song. But one of the interesting things is one of the runners-up was Dixie. And can you imagine today, with all the hoorah that you hear about the eyes of Texas, if the state song of Texas was Dixie, man, we'd never, I don't know where we'd be. One of the other things, though, is that in the first verse, it used to be largest and greatest. And in 1959, when Alaska was admitted to the Union, they changed it to boldest and greatest. So anyhow, they have a little modification, and it wasn't until 1993 that it was actually adopted. So it took a long time to get from here to there. But anyhow, I also had comments that you couldn't read the words last week. So hopefully these are big enough. And if they're not, let me know. We'll increase the font for the folks in the back with the poor eyes. Okay, so here we go. Texas, our Texas, verse number 3. Texas, dear Texas, from tyrant grip now free, shines forth in splendor your star of destiny. Mother of heroes, we come your children true, proclaiming our allegiance, our faith, our love for you. God bless you, Texas, and keep you brave and strong, that you may grow in power and worth throughout the ages long. God bless you, Texas, and keep you brave and strong, that you may grow in power and worth throughout the ages long. Good job.
If you would, please be seated now. Clint, if you would, please, sir, come up and introduce our guest.
Thank you very much, President Jeff. We have a really interesting speaker today, thanks to the efforts of some of our club members. And Bill Tucker came to me with a news article from the Baytown Sun about how Galveston rebuilt after the 1900 hurricane. He said, wouldn't this be a great program? I said, well, sure, but the guy who wrote it's in Baytown. And so I said, but let me talk to Carlina. Well, she took a look at it and she said, oh, the Baytown Sun, that's one of our affiliate newspapers. I'll give the guy a call. And guess what? So we're going to have a great program today. Our speaker is a Baytown native. He graduated from Texas A&M. He spent 10 years flying helicopters in the Navy, and then after that was a maintenance engineer for a number of companies and retired from the Exxon refinery in Baytown. He's a member of the Harris County Historical Commission. He's written numerous historical markers. He writes a column for the Baytown Sun, and that's how we found out about him. he plays the banjo and the fiddle, and I tried to get him to bring the banjo, but he didn't do it. But let's give a warm Rotary welcome to our speaker, Chuck Chandler, who will talk about how Galveston rebuilt.
Wow, you really make me sound impressive. Bear with me just a minute while I. Not that one. It's this one. Are we up? Okay. So what we have here, I'm talking about the rebuilding Galveston. Okay. Notice he didn't introduce me as an expert in IT.
Yeah.
The very first one. Yeah, click this one down here now. Are we good now?
I figured it out.
So when we're talking about Galveston rebuilding, okay, so, so when we're talking about rebuilding Galveston, we really need to go back further than that, because the 1900 storm didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened after years and years and years of problems with water in Galveston. What we have here is an early map. This is 1845. You'll notice there are two bayous that reach up into the further east part of the west part of the island. And in 1845, they were just starting to build, and the Strand district was kind of coming along. The buildings that you see at the Strand now in the historic district didn't exist at the time. How many people have been to Galveston and are familiar with the layout of it? Forget everything you know about Galveston in 1845, because it didn't exist. There was no seawall. If you've been to Crystal Beach, that was more like what Galveston was in 1845. The beach was there. People built their houses all the way up next to the water, next to the Gulf. And every time they get a high wind, the houses would flood. And they'd be walking around in the water. And that's just the way things were in Galveston in 1847. Okay, this one shows the Galveston Island. The populated part in 1860s was the part that you see at where the island or the civilization was. It stopped about 6th Street. There was a little cut just about 6th Street on the eastern part of the island, and that would tend to overflow a lot of times. The western part of the island was unpopulated, and it was mostly what we'd call the historic district of Galveston now. Okay, by the 1860s, they had developed the island, and they had established their residential districts called wards. They still hadn't done anything for the island yet. The earliest storm we know about in Galveston happened in 1527. If you remember way back to your junior high history, Texas history class, Alvaro Nunez Cabeza de Vaca was headed for Florida, and a hurricane that year blew him off course, and it blew him into Galveston. He spent about 10 years after he got shipwrecked on Galveston Island. He had spent about 10 years exploring the Texas area, and a lot of what we know about the early the Indians came from some of his explorations. Another hurricane in 1818 destroyed Jean Lafitte's fleet, drove his ships ashore. He lost 4 ships. And there was a lady named Narcisse Rigon who survived the storm, and she wrote in her memoirs, "This island promises nothing but difficulties." That's pretty apropos there. The early hurricanes weren't named. Naming of the storms didn't happen until 1953. So typically on the early hurricanes, they named them they either called them by the year, or if there was some significant event, they called it by that event. So one of the first storms we have pretty good documentation about was the 1837 storm. That was called Racer's Storm. And it was called Racer because Racer was the name of a British warship that was wrecked in the West Indies, blew the masts off, dismasted it, and it limped into port. And that the logs of that ship is provided the information we know about Racer's Storm. The storm itself kind of skirted the Texas coastline, and it came through and caused a lot of havoc and devastation in Galveston and all the other settlements up in Trinity and Galveston Bay. It may have developed at the Cape Verde Islands, but it hit Galveston in hit Jamaica in September 26th. The Racer had to throw all their cannons overboard and do everything they could to lighten the load. And so with all of the things that the Racer went through, that storm in 1837 became known as Racer's Storm. It was reported in some of the newspapers, the gale force winds persisted over Galveston for 2 days. The new Tremont Hotel was blown over. They didn't have storm certifications, and they didn't have building codes and things like that. So a lot of the buildings in Galveston get blown over by the storm. You see that a lot even in the 1800s in the brick buildings. Colonel Mesa Turner, the commander of the Texas Army at Galveston, it's reported that out of the 25 vessels at anchor, all but one was blown ashore. A Houston newspaper reported the names of a lot of these, but the history of the country, the wreck Tom Toby and the Brutus was considerably injured. And the history of the country contains no records of any hurricane that's equal the force of or the extent of destruction. Now, when I say the extent of destruction, I don't mean the dollar amount. I mean just the vast area that this storm destroyed. Men, women, and children could be seen floating on logs and boards. Small boats were everywhere. On Galveston Island, every structure was destroyed except for the old Mexican custom house. The 80-man garrison from Fort Travis took refuge there, and even that building was swept off of the foundation from the storm surge. Some other soldiers were kind of caught out in the storm. When the storm surge was happening, they kind of made a big pile and to keep from getting swept away. And so most of the wind in the 1837 most of the damage was caused by the wind rather than the storm surge. The Mexican custom house was storm surge, but most of the others was wind. And heavy rain persisted in Houston for 36 hours. It says the Galveston tide level was reported to be 6 or 7 feet higher than the ordinary spring tide. Now that's significant because the ordinary spring tide almost submerged the island anyway. And so everything, the highest point of Galveston at the time was about 8.5 feet above high tide. So if you've already got high tide and you have a storm surge of 8 feet come over, everything's going under. A little bit different than it is today. Ships were left out on the coastal prairie as far as 3 miles from the water. Let's see, 5 years later, another hurricane hit Galveston. It didn't do quite as much damage. I have it in my mind that every time a hurricane passes and the hurricane's gone and all the citizens got that one over with without realizing that there's another one on the horizon, not too far away. Lots of houses were blown off, their foundations. The next big storm that Galveston had was 1854. 1854 was 105 miles an hour winds. Now, when the newspapers reported winds, they usually the winds that they reported are when the anemometer broke off. And there was one report that said that they had 10 inches of rain, but they really don't know how much rain they had because the wind was blowing so hard, it was blowing it right over the top of the rain gauge. So a lot of that rain didn't register. The hurricane of 1854 had an 8-foot storm surge. It completely overflowed Galveston Island. The Texas Ranger, a newspaper from Washington, Texas, reported at San Jacinto at the head of Galveston Bay, the water spread out over the flats from Colonel Washington's to Judge Burnett's place. Imagine at the head of it where Lynchburg is, imagine about a 4-mile wide swath of San Jacinto River, and everything was just underwater. Other newspaper accounts really outline the devastation of it. 1867, there were a couple of storms in the earlier storms in the 1860s. There was, but the big storm in the 1860s was in 1867, and both of those did a lot of damage. One of the big problems they had was in 1867, out of a population of 15,000 in Galveston, there were 1,200 deaths from yellow fever, and another 1,900 died from yellow fever in Houston. So besides all of the hurricanes, they had a lot of other issues that they had to deal with. The newspaper report said that for the 1867 storm said that a strong easterly gale set in and merchants were searching for laborers to move their goods to higher floors, paying them from $4 to $6 an hour. All of these, that's, I did the calculation, that's about $70 to $100 an hour now. So all of these stores that when you go to Galveston, you see the Strand, all of these stores would have been underwater on the first floor, and they would have been moving all of the goods to higher floors. The winds blew all Wednesday night, increasing toward morning. The lower floors on nearly all the stores on the Strand were covered with water 18 inches deep. Vast pile, this was interesting. Vast piles of salt along the sidewalks of the Strand melted away and returned to the sea. They had this salt in sacks, in burlap bags. And when the water came in, it melted all that salt. And so after the waters receded, all they had was all these empty bags laying and a lot of saltier water around them, I guess. All of the wharves were demolished. Railroad bridge connecting the island was gone. The surge in the storm was the highest since the 1837 storm, and it was a foot higher than it was in 1854. And so remember, in 1854, it flooded Lynchburg and all the way up into Houston. So this one was even worse. 1871, there were hurricanes there. There was it said that near the depot, which is where the railroad museum is now, the water was 3 feet deep, and most of the houses in the vicinity were flooded. The inhabitants all had to move to the second story. The steamboat CK Hall, which has a personal interest for me because it was used in the brick trade, bringing bricks from Cedar Bayou where they made them down to Galveston where they were using them. Almost all of the bricks on the historic Strand district were made with buildings were made with bricks that were made in Cedar Bayou and some of the other little communities around Trinity Bay and Galveston Bay. After the 1871 storm, Galveston finally realized that they needed to do something about flooding. So they passed an ordinance to provide for raised sidewalks to help with drainage. If you've been to the Strand, and this is an example of one of the buildings on the Strand, you'll see curbs and sidewalks that are a lot higher than you would normally expect to see. And that's a result of the ordinances that were passed in after the 1871 hurricane. Work began on those raised sidewalks in 1874. Then we have an 1875 hurricane. They called that the Great Indianola Hurricane of 1875. Indianola was a community further south, but the destruction from that hurricane was felt in Galveston just as much as it was felt anywhere along the coast. The hurricane kind of looped around, destroyed Indianola for the first time, and then hit Galveston, caused a lot of damage. The water was 8 feet above the high tide mark and 4 feet above the highest point of land. So imagine living in Galveston and having to go up to the second floor and looking around and seeing nothing but just the top floors of buildings sticking up out of the water. The dozens of coastal schooners washed ashore. The Indianola, after this hurricane, the town pretty much shut down. It was so devastated. It was a major shipping port. In fact, it was more important a shipping port than Galveston was at the time. And because of the first hurricane, about a good percentage of the people that lived there moved away. They rebuilt to some extent, but it really didn't rebuild to the extent that it was before. They were starting to think about Galveston as the primary port at that time. The 1875 hurricane was the most destructive hurricane ever known in Texas as far as material damage at the time. It's the hurricane that made Cedar Bayou one of the brick producing areas because it destroyed all the other brickyards around Galveston Bay. And if you can imagine, if you look at your hand and look at Galveston Bay, Houston is over here. This is the Trinity River coming in over here. Galveston is here, and it had all of these brickyards all around the bay. But the tidal wave from the destruction from the 1875 hurricane shut most of them down. Total rainfall at Galveston was 10.58 inches. Again, that's just what they could measure. It was the most destructive. 771 lives were claimed. And after that hurricane, if you've seen the hurricane flags with the red square flag with the black square in the middle of it, those were developed after the 1875 hurricane. So after that 1875 hurricane, people started thinking, well, maybe we need to do something about protecting Galveston from floods. Yeah, you think so? Well, what they did was they planted a row of cedar trees along the beach. And what they were hoping was that this sand would fill in between the cedar trees and protect the island. They also they laid in 502 cords of brush and covered it with sand and set 632 tons of rocks. So that was the protection they had going into the 1886 hurricane. So in 1886, the first storm of the season was in June. The storm surge cut a channel completely across the east end, completely through the east end of the island. Okay, I'm going to move the mouse, and right through here there was a cut that just it was cut through so cleanly that ships could go in and use that instead of the Bolivar Pass to get in and out of Trinity Bay. Let's see, so it cut it through at the same place that the cut had been made also in 1867 and also in 1874. So they knew this thing was there, and it just kept getting cut through, and then it silt in until the next hurricane. Lots of the railway tracks. If you've been to Galveston, you've seen these railroad tracks. And I heard that they just started running those rail tracks again here lately, within the past month or so. The last time we were down there, they were talking about that. One problem they had with the storm surge was the houses in Galveston were on, a lot of them just sitting on blocks. And when the water had come in, water has a lot more force than wind, and you just knock them off the blocks. And so then they were small enough, I guess, that they could stand them back up on the blocks. And in a lot of places, the water coursed 4 feet deep over the streets. The business districts were flooded, and one of the news reports said that it made it look like Venice. So if you can look at the raised sidewalks and you can imagine water coursing through the streets. And I guess it kind of would look like Venice if they had a few gondolas there. One thing that they were doing was that there were sewers in the streets, sewer covers. So what people would do is they were trying to get to a place of safety. They'd have to walk across the streets, but they didn't know if these sewer covers had floated off. So people were walking along with feeler poles, and they were, feeling in front of them to make sure they wouldn't fall into a sewer hole. And they started talking about a seawall again. The proposal was to construct a continuous seawall 10 feet above mean low tide. And Henry A. Peeler had come up with a design. And it was actually a pretty workable design. He was going to cast these concrete blocks and put them in, and then they would be backfilled with sand. And a group of businessmen, and they were in a group called the Seawall Protection Committee. And they developed a workable plan to pay for it, including a bond election. They even had figured they could sell bonds, and everything looked like they were going to get some kind of protection. But just like everything else, politics, money, and delays. And they decided, well, we had that hurricane, we're good now. And so nothing happened with that one. One reason given against the seawall was by a well-known Galveston figure that it would be an undoubted method of publishing to the world that we consider the situation unsafe. So they didn't build a seawall then either. That was in 1886. They had a couple of little small hurricanes after that, and some tropical storms, but they thought they dodged the bullet after the 1886 storm all the way up until September of 1900. All we know about 1900 storm is that it formed at sea. They got some reports from the Caribbean. On August the 27th, 1900, a ship about 1,000 miles east of the Caribbean logged into an area of unsettled weather. By the time it reached the Florida Straits, it was a tropical storm and entered the Gulf of Mexico with 100-knot winds. On September 8th, it hit Galveston as a Category 4 hurricane. The highest point of the city of Galveston was 8.7 feet above sea level, and the hurricane brought a storm surge of 15 feet over that. Dr. Klein was a director of the director of the Texas section of the U.S. Weather Service. Before the hurricane, after the 1891 storm, he had taken over that position. And the Galveston News in 1891 published a recap of all the previous hurricanes, and it was written by Dr. Isaac Klein. He closed it by saying, the opinion held by some that Galveston will at some time be seriously damaged by some disturbance is simply an absurd delusion and can only have its origin in the imagination and not from reasoning. And he was the director of the Texas section of the U.S. Weather Service. So, yeah, well, there's more. We'll learn more about him. A few weeks after the storm, he submitted a report that was published in the monthly Weather Review, where he described the approach and passage of the storm. He said the anemometer blew away when the wind reached 100 miles an hour, but before 8 p.m. it had attained at least 120. He was left his house to try to go home waist deep waters. He was by this time people were wandering the streets trying to find shelter from the storm. He was running into groups of 40 and 50 people just wandering around, not knowing what to do and where to go. They decided it was really kind of suicidal to try to make their way through the storm because of all the debris that was flying around. Glass was flying, timbers were flying, nails were flying, everything was going. At 8:30, his residence blew down, and about 50 persons who had sought it in safety, all but 18 were hurled into were lost, hurled into eternity. He lost his wife, who never rose above the water. He was nearly drowned, drifted for 300 yards from where he started in the water. He closed his report that I just mentioned, saying, "I believe that a seawall which would have broken the swells would have saved much life and property. And I did not foresee the magnitude of the damage that the storm would do." Famous last words. Nobody knows how many died in that storm. A lot of entire families were lost, so there was no report, no way to report, no way to know how many people. The best estimates are somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 people dying in one storm, if you can imagine that today. So finally, they thought, they figured, well, maybe it was time to build a wall. So after the 1900 storm, it was they put a plan in process that was 2 steps. First, the seawall would be constructed, and then the land would be built. They figured out a payment for it. The seawall itself, because it would be protecting the forts and the defense perimeters of the island, would be somewhat paid for by the government. The raising the island itself would be done by the people in the with some tax relief from the state. So I can get started here. Okay, in the 1900 storm, the part that you see shaded is what was totally and completely destroyed. The storm surge, all of these frame houses that existed all throughout the crosshatched area that existed in the crosshatch area, the storm surge shoved that towards the downtown area. And the further it went, the more houses and the more frame structures it piled up in front of it. Finally, the storm surge got to the point where the weight and the mass of all of this debris that had been pushed inland finally stopped the storm surge and protected it before it reached the business district, or what we call a historic district now. So the historic district, because it was protected by all of the devastation going on around it, is why that Galveston still has wood, old brick buildings there. A lot of those old brick buildings lost their top floors when the wind blew the floor off, and it was pretty devastating on that. So they figured out how to pay for it. The first phase was to drive the pilings for the foundation. These were And this is some devastation from the storm. Trying to look through bifocals. As you can see, the buildings were destroyed. It was the buildings you see here had stuff around them, had frame houses around them in most cases, and that's all gone. The brick buildings that stood were, they were protected by all those frame houses in a big part of it. But through all of the crosshatch area that you saw earlier was just total destruction, just like what we're seeing here. Some houses kind of stayed intact, but really weren't viable to live in anymore. And all of this destruction and all this devastation that you see had people that were dead in among them. After the storm, they started gathering the dead up and they sent them out into the Gulf on barges. And then they were dumping them overboard just because there were so many of them they couldn't handle it. And then they floated back onto the beach. And then they built funeral pyres. And if you've seen the news reports of some of the hurricanes, and not hurricanes, but the epidemic in India, where they had the funeral pyres and all the people that died, they were just, body after body after body. They had these pyres going all the time. And this is what the people were looking at when they woke up the next morning. So what the plan was, it was going to be a 2-step process. The first thing was to build the seawall, and so you can't just go out there and start pouring concrete on the sand. That won't work. But have any of you heard the Robert's Rules of Order, the rules for conducting meetings? The man that wrote that was the Colonel Roberts that was in charge of the design and the getting started building the seawall. That was the same man. And so what they first did was, I need bifocals that read longer. Yeah. Okay, so what the first step was to drive pilings into the sand. And they had pilings that were up to 70-foot long cedar and cypress logs that they had brought in. A lot of those probably came from Cedar Bayou at the top of Galveston Bay. But the first thing they did was sank thousands and thousands of these cedar logs in as footings. They drove them down to bedrock. And once they got these footings piled in down where my mouth is. So they drove the pilings in with pile drivers. And then once they got the pilings driven in, then they could start. Here we go. Then they can start laying in the footing for the seawall. And so this footing was this continuous poured. They had built a railroad track behind where they were going to do the seawall, and they had the concrete mixer, and they had everything they needed to pour this footing mounted on rails. And as they drove down the tracks, then they could use gantry cranes to put the concrete over into the footing for the seawall. Does that work? Oh, perfect. Okay, so here you see the pilings for the seawall, and I've looked, and I've never been able to find. These pilings were made out of wood. Granted, it was cedar and cypress, but they've been in there 100 years. And I'm wondering how intact, and that's fairly resistant to rot, but I've not been able to find an answer of if they've done any testing and see how good those pilings still are. Huh? They're gonna rot. Oh, they're gonna rot. Yeah, eventually they may have to redo the seawall. I mean, but this shows what they were doing, and it was pretty much a solid run and a solid pour. And but the first thing they had to do is get this footing done for the seawall before they could start building up. And it was a continuous operation as they were running the footing down. Once they got far enough, then they started building sections of the seawall. I have too many pictures here. They also, before they started building the seawall, they put all of these huge granite blocks, this riprap. And what that was to do, it was intended that over time, those blocks would sink into the sand. And that would protect the seawall from being undercut by the waves. So people say, well, gosh, these things are sinking. Well, that was what they're designed to do. And every once in a while, I imagine they bring some in and replenish them. But they had the blocks put in. And then they started building up. And they started with a section of wall that was, I think it was 40 feet wide or 40 feet long at this particular one. The concrete was poured in a continuous pour on each one of these sections, and they interlocked. And if you look down here at the bottom, at the very foot of it, you'll see a granite tablet, and that's they was the cornerstone for the seawall. And they moved it up on top and set it on top of the seawall now where you can see it. But this gives you a scale of it. It was 16 feet thick at the bottom. It was 17 feet high, and it was like 5 or 6 feet across at the very top. And it was designed like this so that as the waves came in, it would deflect them up rather than just crashing against the seawall. And But they made these pours, they made the first pour, and then they started skipping sections so they could let the section dry and then, or cure, and then come back and pour the section between it. So they were leapfrogging as they were going. And they just progressed all the way down. Originally, the original plan was that the seawall would be 3 miles long. They've since extended it long past 3 miles. And I should have called a little bit more. Okay, then once they finished the seawall, then the next step was to raise the island. The first thing they did was dig a channel behind the seawall so that the dredge boats could operate in that area. So Seawall Boulevard, as you see it today, still hadn't been built yet, but they did have a channel that was big enough to float these huge dredge boats. And they dredged the sand out of the channel coming into the Galveston port, which two things. One is it gave them the sand they needed, and the other thing is it allowed them to deepen the port, take bigger ships in. So it was really kind of a twofold gain for them. And so then this shows how this was taken in, this wasn't a hurricane, it was a storm afterwards, shortly after the seawall was finished. And the first 3 mile section of seawall was finished in about 1905, early part of 1905. And after that, they took a lot of pictures. Okay, so I get to the, yeah. Okay, they raised everything. They raised fire plugs, they raised sewer lines, they raised telephone poles, they raised electrical service. This shows a picture of a fire plug before they've extended the plug up to grade level. They came in and they made marks, and then these dredge boats came in and pumped sand, a slurry of sand up into the section. They divided the section of Galveston up into 4 block squares, and they did a block at a time. They came in and raised the 42-inch pipes. This gives you a feel of how big the pipe was as they were going. So they raised everything up. They raised houses up. They even raised trees up. None of those lived. But they raised everything up. They even raised the headstones at the cemetery. A friend of mine's a bricklayer in Galveston. He said he's seen the buildups of bricks where they raised the headstones up before they pumped the slurry back in. This is one of the dredge boats coming in right there. This shows the channel as it's behind the seawall. Even some of the big brick buildings, the big stone churches, they raised up. Once they got them raised up, they started pumping the slurry in, and they raised them up. Some of them raised up on bricks, some of them just raised up on wooden jack screws. Some of them they couldn't raise. Some of them the people could. You were responsible for raising your own house. So if you couldn't afford to have your house raised and you had a 2-story house, in a lot of cases, what they would do is just fill the first story in full of sand. And now you've got a 1-story house, but at least you've still got a house. So here's a house that was more houses that were being raised. And as they were doing this, they made these boardwalks between houses. They built racks between the trains and the house where you could get off the train and walk the boardwalk to your house. Okay, here's as they were raising this house. And here's a before and after there. Okay, there's the house as it was raised, and then when they filled in the sand underneath it, that's it. This is how they divided the area up into squares, and as they moved across, they just filled these squares up. This house and this house are the same house after it was filled. So that gives you an indication of how high they lifted everything. This shows the railroad tracks. As you got off the track, you walked up that ladder up to the boardwalk that took you to your house. And so that went on through gosh, it took them until probably 1913, I think, to finish doing that work. It worked out so well that they extended the seawall another 7 miles. They continued to raise the island. If you remember those very first pictures I showed that showed those 2 bayous on the western part of the island, those have now been filled in. And if you look at the United States Geographical Survey from 1964, it says that Galveston has nothing but sand, which is true, because everything else was filled up. I kind of blasted through that last part, but are there any questions or any? So when you go to Galveston and you look at this stuff, imagine in your mind's eye, all of these houses being about 7 feet lower, the seawall not being there, and all of the houses and everything just butting up to the beach. Yes, ma'am. Okay, they started that part of it right after they finished the seawall. So they started that in 1905, and it took probably 15 years for it to be completely through with that part of it. It took a long time. I don't really know how long it took them to fill a single section of it, but I would imagine each section, there were hundreds of sections that made up the grid that they were filling. So each section probably went fairly fast, but if you're out of your house and living in an elevated structure and having to deal with everything they had to deal with, and nowadays I can't imagine people would stay. Yes, sir. Yes. Remember, this is 1900. Was there a dollar amount put on? And start to finish, the whole thing took $3.5 million for that first 3 miles. That was the first 3 miles. Now today it's another 7, or it's further than that. But for those first 3 miles, it was about $3.5 million. Part of that was paid by the government because of the protection of the defense perimeter. The house raising, people raised their own houses, but the filling was done by the city with the understanding that they would get tax breaks from the state. They wouldn't have to pay taxes to the state for, I think, 3 years while they were doing this. Well, this was definitely an infrastructure plan. No doubt about that. But this is really what allowed Galveston to be a viable city today.
This is fabulous. You will stay afterwards.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to stay and visit and talk. And
Thank you, Clint, because I didn't want to cut him off, because that's very interesting. So Trey, I know you had a question for him, so we'll get afterwards. So World Polio Day is the 24th. We are going to have Pints for Polio at the Trailhead Beer Garden at Schreiner University on Sunday, the 24th. Next Wednesday, after Brad Barnett from the Chamber speaks, we're going to have our bake auction with our very own professional live auctioneer, Todd Odom, doing the auction. It was brought to my attention today, which is a very great idea. If we bake anything, if we put nuts in it, some people are allergic to nuts. If you put, nuts or no nuts, or what kind of nuts, that way people can know if they can eat it or not. So thank you for that. $20 minimum bid on the auction items is what I've got here as well. So Jeff is handing me this so we can just get it all knocked out at once. Families in Rotary, please keep Tom Terrell in your thoughts and prayers. Tom is struggling right now, and we just think about him and his wife and family. And wonderful to have the Huttos back with us in Stockton. Power of Prayer, wonderful for you guys. Thank y'all for being here. And Kelly Early has a paid announcement, followed by Dave Samuel.
Real quick, Tuesday night, the Republican Women of Kerr County are having what we call our Pistols and Pearls annual fundraiser. We're going to have Scott Gage from the Kerrville, Kerr County Sheriff's Office is going to come and talk to us about gun safety. And then we're going to have Tara Micah from the NRA, who's going to be there to give us an update on all the new laws on if you're going to carry your pistol, you need to come on out and get all the details on what you need to know before you do that. So it's at the Ag Barn at 5:30 on Tuesday night, and tickets are available on Eventbrite. And if you're interested, see me after the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Dave?
Yes, you all have done wonderfully good responses to signing up so far. For instance, the last day, I think all of them home, like that's the day before Christmas. The first day, however, we only have one sign up. That would be the Saturday after Thanksgiving. So if you're interested in sign up, what I wanted to show you is two things. How to sign up. Y'all have access, hopefully you can see this too. This screen, when you go to Rotary, Kerrville, and you scroll down, and you see here, there's events on this white column. And all you gotta do, if I can do something like now, is find one that's the date you like. There'll be 4 listed with a different date. And if you click on it, it'll give you this. What's important is, this says guest registration. We don't care. Don't use that. If you hit it, nothing will happen. And that's fine. If you hit the one with the date, it will present to you a sign opportunity. And I can't see my cursor, but hit that little blue. So, okay. So, and then get it, ask me to sign in, whatever. Go ahead and sign up. We're doing pretty good. I'm a little short. I'm not going to be here for the next 2 Wednesdays, so I'm going to be here today. If you know when you might want to sign up, find a friend, find a pastor, find somebody you want to get involved in doing good, and have a couple weekends. It's fun. Takes only an hour. If you can afford it, I'd love it if you could do 2. Bring your spouse, parole officer, whatever you got. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dave. For our Rotarians online, Dave is pleading for assistance in the bell ringing at Gibson's, as we do every year. Wine giveaway. Giveaway. Bruce McKenzie, do you have your pen on? Well, come on up, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, wine wagon, bring it. It's for, that is for the giveaway at Pints for Polio. That's at the trailhead on Sunday, the 24th. You can bring it soon, or you can bring it to Amber Thomason's office, or you can bring it to the event. So we do have some Rotarians with guests today. I'm just going to kind of spurt them out real quick. Mr. Hutto, you brought your wife Becky with you, and she's going to join Rotary. So Gina Daniels, you have a guest. Shannon, thank you for being here with us. We spoke to her a little bit before Rotary, and she is fun. So Tanner, you're again with us with Tanner's joining Rotary. He's actually Philip's guest. And Philip Stacy, you have a guest with us. Awesome. Welcome, Paul. Thank you. All right. As I said a while ago, Brad Barnett is the speaker next week. That will be from the Chamber of Commerce, as well as the bake auction that we have. So with that, we are running a little bit late, and I do apologize, but if you would please stand and join in the 4-way testimony, please. of the things we think, say, or do is the truth, fair to all concerned. Will it build goodwill and better friendships, beneficial to all concerned?